Is modern-day Israel really the Israel we read about in the Bible? Are we, as Christians, aligning with God's vision by supporting it unconditionally? These are the big questions we're tackling today. For many Christians, supporting Israel seems like a straightforward way to honor God's promises in Scripture. After all, wasn't Israel promised to Abraham and his descendants forever? This belief has fueled decades of unwavering support for Israel in Christian communities around the world. But here's where things get complex, and perhaps uncomfortable. The Israel we see today was established in 1948, largely as a result of political movements and secular ideals, a stark difference from the deeply covenantal, spiritual nation described in the Bible. This difference leads us to an essential question. Are modern Christians supporting Israel out of genuine biblical conviction, or have we conflated political ideology with biblical promise? If you've ever felt conflicted or questioned how best to stand with Israel as a Christian, this video might give you a fresh perspective rooted in both faith and Scripture. Let's explore if we as Christians are truly honoring the Bible's teachings, or if we've missed a crucial part of God's vision. For decades, a central belief has shaped how many Christians view Israel: the idea that modern Israel is the fulfillment of God's ancient promises to Abraham and his descendants. This belief isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a powerful conviction that influences Christian support for Israel worldwide, often framed as aligning with God's plan for the world. Many Christians base this support on verses like Genesis 12 verse 3, where God tells Abraham, "I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse." For some, this verse signifies a direct mandate to support Israel. The thought process is simple. If modern Israel is the continuation of biblical Israel, then standing with it is not only right but spiritually mandated. This belief is further bolstered by a theological perspective called Christian Zionism, which interprets modern Israel as a fulfillment of biblical prophecies and a key player in the events leading up to the return of Christ. For these Christians, supporting Israel is part of preparing the world for God's ultimate plan. But is this view grounded in Scripture, or is it based more on a political and cultural narrative? In many cases, Christians are urged to support Israel without questioning its current state or secular governance. Yet, in the Bible, the covenant with Israel was deeply tied to obedience to God's commandments and a commitment to reflect His character. This begs the question, does modern Israel embody these same covenantal principles? While many Christians view modern Israel as a biblical fulfillment, there's a side to Israel today that often goes unspoken in Christian circles: its largely secular nature. Established in 1948, the modern state of Israel was born out of a political movement rather than a religious revival. The movement known as Zionism aimed to create a safe, sovereign homeland for Jewish people. A noble goal, but one driven primarily by secular leaders, not by religious principles or biblical commandments. This difference is significant. In the Bible, Israel's identity is inseparable from its relationship with God and obedience to His laws. The Israel of Scripture was called to be a holy people, a nation set apart, governed by laws meant to reflect God's character and covenant. But the modern state of Israel operates primarily as a democratic, secular nation. Decisions are made not necessarily with religious convictions in mind but with political and security concerns at the forefront. Many of Israel's leaders over the decades, including key figures in its founding, were secular or even agnostic, viewing Israel's establishment as a cultural and national necessity rather than a divine mandate. This makes the modern state of Israel fundamentally different from the theocratic Israel of the Bible. This contrast invites Christians to reconsider their support. Is it truly biblically driven, or does it stem from an idealized view of Israel that may not align with reality? And if Israel today isn't governed by the same covenantal principles, how does this affect Christian solidarity with it? When we read about Israel in the Bible, it's clear that the concept of Israel goes far beyond physical territory. God's relationship with Israel was rooted in a covenant, a spiritual promise that required both obedience and dedication to His laws. Israel wasn't just a plot of land, it was a people chosen to reflect God's values, justice, and mercy. This covenantal relationship made Israel's identity as much about spiritual alignment as it was about any geographical borders. One of the core biblical teachings on Israel shows that being Israel meant living under God's guidance. For example, when the Israelites abandoned these laws and turned to other gods, they faced exile and hardship. This pattern repeats throughout the Old Testament, underscoring that God's favor was deeply tied to their faithfulness, not just their nationality or land. Today, the modern state of Israel is largely defined by its borders and its status as a Jewish homeland. But does this land-focused identity fulfill the same spiritual role described in Scripture? Some Christians argue that simply possessing the land doesn't equate to fulfilling the covenant. In fact, the Bible often warned that physical occupation without obedience wouldn't suffice. In Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, God laid out blessings and curses based on Israel's obedience, showing that the land itself wasn't the promise, faithfulness was. This brings us to an important point. If modern Israel operates independently of this covenantal relationship, is it still the same Israel in the eyes of God? For Christians, this question is crucial. It challenges the notion of supporting Israel solely because of its geography and instead emphasizes the importance of a relationship with God as the defining feature of Israel. For Christians, this reflection encourages a deeper understanding of what it means to stand with Israel. Does it mean supporting a political entity or recognizing the spiritual truths that defined Israel in the Bible? By examining this, we see that our role may be less about land and more about supporting those values, faithfulness, justice, and alignment with God's will, that the Bible calls us to uphold. As Christians, we're called to base our beliefs and actions on Scripture, not merely on political or cultural norms. When it comes to supporting modern Israel, this commitment to Scripture challenges us to take a closer look. Does unconditional support for the state of Israel align with the Bible? Or could this support be more complex than we often consider? Many Christian perspectives on Israel are built on verses like Genesis 12 verse 3, "I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse." But is this verse, spoken to Abraham, directly applicable to a secular nation-state in the modern world? Some theologians argue that the blessing was about a spiritual lineage that honors God's covenant, not just about one geographical area or people. Supporting Israel then could mean supporting a commitment to God's values rather than a political stance. Additionally, the Bible places a strong emphasis on justice, mercy, and humility before God. When Christians unconditionally support any nation or government without discernment, it raises ethical and spiritual questions. Israel today is a complex state involved in long-standing regional conflicts, particularly with the Palestinian people. Does unwavering support for Israel align with the values of justice and compassion that Jesus exemplified? This reflection doesn't necessarily mean opposing Israel or neglecting its significance in Christian faith. Instead, it invites us to ask if our support reflects a biblical perspective that prioritizes God's covenant and values over political allegiance. As followers of Christ, we're called to be peacemakers and advocates for justice. Could approaching Israel with a heart for discernment, peace, and biblical truth lead to a more faithful witness? In the book of Genesis, God made a profound promise to Abraham that has become the cornerstone of Israel's identity. In Genesis 12 verses 1-3 and Genesis 15, God tells Abraham that his descendants will inherit a vast land stretching beyond what we know as modern-day Israel. However, this promise wasn't simply about geography, it was deeply conditional on a covenant with God. God's covenant with Abraham went beyond a simple gift of land. It required obedience, righteousness, and a commitment to live in a way that honored God. In Genesis 17 verses 9-10, God says, "As for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you for the generations to come." The land promise was intertwined with a call to holiness and a relationship with God, emphasizing that Israel's identity was fundamentally tied to spiritual obedience. Fast forward to today and the question arises, does modern Israel's establishment fulfill this covenant promise? Some argue that the presence of a Jewish state is a continuation of the promise, but others point out that this land promise wasn't solely about physical occupation. In fact, many instances in the Old Testament highlight that whenever Israel strayed from God's commands, the land promise was jeopardized. The prophets frequently warned that the covenant was about relationship, not just territory. For Christians, understanding this covenant is key to discerning what it means to support Israel today. If the promise to Abraham was based on obedience and covenant, then standing with Israel could mean standing with values that uphold God's commands. It may mean praying for Israel to return to a spiritual relationship with God rather than only supporting a modern political entity. In the Bible, Israel's purpose was never solely about nationhood, it was about embodying a covenant relationship with God. From the beginning, God called Israel to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, Exodus 19 verse 6. This calling was unique, not just to possess land but to represent God's values, laws and presence among the nations. Biblical Israel was intended to stand apart, demonstrating a lifestyle that reflected justice, mercy, and a profound commitment to God. When Israel adhered to this purpose, they experienced peace, blessing, and prosperity. But when they abandoned it, embracing idolatry or injustice, they faced exile, hardship, and, at times, even the loss of the land itself. These consequences underscored that Israel's role was covenantal and spiritual, with the land being part of a larger relationship, not merely a national right. In modern terms, the secular state of Israel, while deeply significant, operates differently. It functions primarily as a political entity, often focused on national security and sovereignty rather than reflecting the spiritual mission that defined biblical Israel. This difference has led some Christians to question if supporting the modern state in every aspect truly aligns with supporting the Israel of Scripture. For Christians, this reflection is vital. If the Israel we're called to support is meant to be a holy nation, then maybe our role isn't just to support a political entity but to pray for its spiritual revival and alignment with God's original covenant. It's an opportunity to view support as something more than political allegiance, instead aligning it with the hope for Israel to embrace its deeper spiritual calling. The modern state of Israel as we know it today was officially established in 1948, but its roots trace back to the late 19th century. After centuries of Jewish diaspora, a political movement called Zionism emerged in Europe, aimed at creating a safe homeland for Jewish people. This movement was led largely by secular Jews, focused not on a religious mandate but on ensuring safety, security, and self-determination in a world where Jewish communities often face severe persecution. The horrors of the Holocaust accelerated global support for a Jewish state, leading to the establishment of Israel as a refuge. However, it's crucial to note that the Zionist movement was, at its core, a secular initiative. It wasn't primarily about fulfilling biblical prophecy or reclaiming a covenantal promise. It was about national survival and cultural identity. For Christians, understanding this foundation provides context for the modern Israeli state's secular nature. Unlike the theocratic Israel of the Bible, which was meant to reflect God's covenant, modern Israel is a political entity born from the necessity of survival. This difference challenges us to discern how, or if, it aligns with the biblical Israel we see in Scripture. Zionism, the movement that ultimately led to the formation of modern Israel, began in the late 19th century as a response to growing anti-Semitism in Europe. Initially, it was a political and cultural movement focused on establishing a safe homeland for Jewish people, a place where they could live freely without fear of persecution. For the early Zionists, this was a matter of national identity and survival, not necessarily a religious mission. One key distinction is that Zionism was largely secular in nature. The founders, including prominent figures like Theodor Herzl, were not primarily motivated by biblical prophecies or a covenantal promise but by the need for a sovereign Jewish state. They sought a national identity that would unify Jewish people culturally and politically, not solely through religious or spiritual ties. Today, Zionism remains a significant force in Israeli politics and society, driving much of the country's national identity and policies. This secular foundation of Zionism presents a different picture than the theocratic nation described in the Bible, inviting Christians to examine if their support for Israel aligns with the values and goals set forth by this movement. One of the defining characteristics of modern Israel is its governance by predominantly secular leaders. Since its founding, Israel has been shaped by leaders who prioritize political sovereignty, national security, and the preservation of a Jewish cultural identity, often over religious or covenantal principles. While there is certainly a strong religious presence within Israel, the leadership and primary political drivers have historically been secular. Figures like David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, saw the state of Israel as a homeland for Jewish people but operated within a framework that was cultural and political, not necessarily religious. For many Israeli leaders, the focus is on maintaining a stable and secure nation amid complex regional tensions, rather than establishing a nation modeled strictly on biblical values. This secular approach can create a disconnect for Christians who view Israel through a biblical lens, expecting it to reflect covenantal principles. Recognizing the secular nature of Israel's leadership encourages Christians to approach their support thoughtfully, acknowledging that the priorities of modern Israel may not always align with the theocratic vision of Israel described in Scripture. The biblical origin of Israel as a nation begins with the story of Jacob, Abraham's grandson, who was given the name Israel by God. In Genesis 32 verse 28, after wrestling with an angel, Jacob is told, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." This renaming signified a profound spiritual transformation, marking Jacob and his descendants as a people chosen to live in covenant with God. This covenant, however, wasn't merely about land. It symbolized a unique relationship with God, rooted in obedience and a commitment to reflect His character. The term Israel thus carries a spiritual meaning beyond nationality, embodying a calling to live in alignment with God's laws and purposes. This concept of Israel is about more than territory, it's about a people embodying a divine promise and responsibility. In contrast, the modern state of Israel identifies primarily as a political nation, with diverse citizens who may not all share this covenantal relationship. For Christians, understanding this distinction invites reflection. Is supporting Israel about a physical land, or is it about upholding the spiritual lineage that Jacob's story represents? In Scripture, Israel's purpose was deeply connected to its role as a covenant people, unlike to the nations, Isaiah 49 verse 6, meant to reflect God's laws, justice, and love to the world. Israel's mission wasn't simply to exist as a nation-state but to serve as an example of a people living in harmony with God's commandments. This spiritual purpose defined Israel's identity, setting it apart as a model of faithfulness, compassion, and righteousness. God's laws given to Israel in the Old Testament were intended to create a just society, one that demonstrated His character to surrounding nations. This purpose underscored that Israel's calling was much more than national prosperity or territorial control. It was a spiritual mission rooted in covenantal fidelity. When Israel strayed from this purpose, the prophets repeatedly warned that their status and blessings were at risk, emphasizing that their identity was tied to God's covenant, not merely their land. This distinction is crucial for Christians reflecting on Israel today. If the Israel of Scripture was meant to represent God's covenant and character, then support for Israel might mean something more than political backing. It could mean praying for a return to spiritual alignment with God's purposes. When comparing biblical Israel with modern Israel, a clear difference emerges in purpose and motivation. Biblical Israel was defined by its role as a theocratic nation, called to live under God's laws and embody His character. This role meant that Israel's identity was inseparable from its spiritual mission. In contrast, modern Israel, while a Jewish state, primarily operates as a secular democracy, driven by national interests, security concerns, and cultural identity rather than a direct adherence to biblical laws. Modern Israel's focus is, understandably, on the survival and prosperity of its citizens in a complex political landscape. While many Israelis are deeply committed to their Jewish heritage, the state itself is governed by secular principles, and its policies are shaped by practical and geopolitical considerations. This creates a departure from the theocratic vision of Israel we find in Scripture, where the nation's primary purpose was to reflect God's covenant. For Christians, this distinction is significant. Supporting Israel today doesn't automatically equate to supporting a biblical ideal. It's supporting a modern state with its own unique goals and challenges. Understanding this difference can guide Christians to consider how their support aligns with both the biblical vision of Israel and the realities of the current state. In many Christian circles, support for Israel is often justified by specific verses in Scripture. One of the most commonly cited is Genesis 12 verse 3, where God tells Abraham, "I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse." Many interpret this to mean that Christians must support Israel to receive God's blessing. But is this verse meant to apply to a secular nation-state, or was it intended for the spiritual lineage of Abraham's covenant people? Another verse frequently referenced is Psalm 122 verse 6, which says, "Pray for the peace of Jerusalem." While this is indeed a beautiful call, it may not directly translate to political support. Praying for Jerusalem's peace can mean desiring justice, reconciliation, and spiritual revival, rather than endorsing all of modern Israel's political actions. Similarly, end-times interpretations often see Israel as central to prophecy, leading some Christians to support Israel unconditionally as a way to align with God's plan. However, this view can sometimes bypass the importance of discernment and the ethical principles emphasized by Jesus. The Bible calls Christians to pursue justice, mercy, and humility, Micah 6 verse 8, values that Jesus highlighted in His teachings. Blind support for any political entity, without questioning if it aligns with these values, risks straying from the heart of the gospel. Supporting Israel through a biblical lens might mean standing up for God's covenant values, justice, mercy, and truth, rather than simply aligning with nationalistic goals. For Christians, these verses encourage a more nuanced perspective. Instead of interpreting blessings or prayers as automatic political endorsements, Christians can reflect on how their support aligns with God's character. Perhaps standing with Israel means encouraging a return to spiritual covenant and calling rather than political allegiance. When it comes to supporting modern Israel, Christians face ethical and moral questions, especially regarding the ongoing Palestinian conflict. The situation is complex, involving historical grievances, security concerns, and deeply rooted cultural identities on both sides. For many Christians, supporting Israel is seen as supporting God's chosen people. However, unconditional support can sometimes overlook the ethical dimensions of these conflicts, such as issues of displacement, military actions, and the treatment of Palestinians. The Bible consistently calls Christians to uphold justice and compassion, advocating for the oppressed and seeking peace. Jesus' teachings emphasize love for one's neighbors and even one's enemies, challenging believers to pursue peace and reconciliation. In this light, an unquestioning stance toward Israel's political actions may conflict with these core Christian values, particularly when innocent lives are affected by military or political decisions. This isn't to say that Christians must oppose Israel. Rather, it encourages a balanced approach that considers the ethical consequences of support. Perhaps the most biblically faithful position is one that prays for peace, stands for justice, and supports efforts toward reconciliation, striving to reflect the values of Jesus in the midst of a complex geopolitical issue. Since its establishment in 1948, modern Israel has been entangled in a series of regional conflicts, many of which have profoundly shaped its identity and relationships with neighboring countries. From the Arab-Israeli wars to the ongoing tensions with Gaza and the West Bank, Israel's position in the Middle East is marked by both a need for security and a history of territorial disputes. These conflicts have often placed Israel in a position of both defense and dominance, leading to a complicated dynamic with the surrounding nations. For Christians, Israel's military engagements raise questions about support and the broader call to be peacemakers. Jesus taught his followers to pursue peace and to love their neighbors, principles that can feel at odds with the realities of modern warfare and territorial disputes. While Israel faces legitimate security threats, the impact on civilian populations and the cycle of retaliation and resistance complicate an uncritical stance of support. This perspective invites Christians to approach their view of Israel with compassion and a desire for peace in the region. Praying for peace in the Middle East means hoping for reconciliation and justice on both sides of these conflicts, reflecting a commitment to biblical values rather than nationalistic or political allegiances alone. In the midst of ongoing conflict, Christians are called to a unique role, peacemakers. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." Matthew 5 verse 9. This call challenges believers to prioritize peace and reconciliation, even in situations as complex as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Rather than taking sides based on political allegiance, Christians can approach the situation with a heart for healing, justice, and compassion for all involved. Peacemaking means recognizing the humanity and dignity of both Israelis and Palestinians. It means advocating for solutions that reduce suffering, promote justice, and bring stability to a region where people on both sides have endured decades of hardship. For Christians, this may involve supporting humanitarian efforts, praying for leaders on all sides to seek wisdom and peace, and resisting narratives that demonize one group over another. By approaching Israel with a focus on peacemaking, Christians embody Christ's teachings and set an example of love and reconciliation. This perspective doesn't negate support for Israel, but it broadens it to encompass a commitment to peace, reflecting a higher allegiance to God's kingdom values over political boundaries. Zionism's impact extends beyond Israel's borders, significantly influencing Western politics, particularly in the United States. Since the establishment of Israel, many Western nations have maintained close ties with the state, often viewing Israel as a key ally in the Middle East. This support has led to considerable financial, military, and diplomatic backing, with Zionism as a significant cultural and political force in shaping these alliances. For many Christians, especially those who see Israel's existence as biblically significant, this influence aligns with their beliefs. However, others caution against allowing political ideologies to overtake biblical values. In recent years, the complex narrative around Zionism has sparked intense debate, with some raising concerns about its influence in media and policy. While Christians are called to be discerning, it's essential to avoid conspiracy theories or exaggerated claims that can lead to misunderstanding or prejudice. Instead, a balanced Christian perspective recognizes the reality of Zionism's influence while grounding one's beliefs in Scripture and the teachings of Jesus. Rather than getting caught up in political currents, Christians can aim to approach the topic with wisdom and an unwavering commitment to truth, justice, and compassion. For many Christians, the events surrounding modern Israel evoke thoughts of biblical prophecies and the end times. Passages in books like Ezekiel, Daniel, and Revelation describe future conflicts and events that some interpret as involving Israel. One prominent prophecy is the War of Gog and Magog from Ezekiel 38-39, where a coalition of nations comes against Israel, only to be defeated by divine intervention. Some believe this prophecy points to a future conflict centered around modern Israel, aligning with current geopolitical tensions. However, end-times prophecy is a complex and often debated topic in Christianity. Some theologians interpret these prophecies symbolically, seeing them as descriptions of spiritual warfare or general patterns rather than specific future events. Others view the formation of Israel in 1948 as a sign of God's timeline progressing toward the end times. This perspective leads some Christians to support Israel, seeing it as integral to the fulfillment of God's plan. The diversity in interpretations suggests that caution and discernment are essential. While prophecy can guide Christians in understanding God's overall plan, it's also a call to live faithfully in the present, prioritizing justice, mercy, and humility, Micah 6 verse 8. Rather than letting prophecy become a reason for political allegiance, Christians can view it as a reminder of God's sovereignty, encouraging prayer for peace, and an ethical commitment to Christ's teachings. In examining Israel through the lens of prophecy, Christians are reminded to keep their focus on faithful living, trusting in God's ultimate plan rather than being swayed solely by political events. As Christians reflect on their support for Israel, the ultimate call is to live faithfully, aligning actions with biblical principles rather than political agendas. Faithful living means discerning our beliefs and commitments based on Scripture, seeking to reflect the values of Jesus, compassion, justice, and truth. Rather than adopting a stance rooted solely in national or political loyalty, we are called to anchor our support in the teachings of Christ, which often challenge us to transcend worldly allegiances. Jesus taught that his kingdom is not of this world, John 18 verse 36, a reminder that our highest loyalty is to God's kingdom. For Christians, this might mean praying for peace in Israel and the surrounding region, advocating for justice on all sides, and fostering reconciliation. It also means recognizing the complexity of supporting a modern nation-state, which may not always align with the covenantal principles described in Scripture. By focusing on faithful living, Christians are called to witness a love that seeks peace, truth, and justice for all people involved. Supporting Israel then becomes less about nationalistic fervor and more about supporting God's desire for justice and righteousness. It's about embodying Christ's teachings and bearing witness to his love in a way that transcends borders and politics. As we conclude, this reflection isn't about abandoning support for Israel but about approaching it with discernment, guided by Scripture and a heart for God's kingdom. Our allegiance to Christ calls us to prioritize values that honor him, encouraging Christians to support not just a political entity but the spiritual values that the Bible calls us to uphold.